She marched up in wedge heels and a clipboard, barking that my native wildflowers were a code violation. Said if I didn't mow them down, I'd be fined $250 a day. She even circled my milkweed with a red marker. But what Karen didn't know, I'm the one who wrote the state's landscape ordinance. My name's Tanya Blake, and I've lived in Riverbend Hills for a little over 6 years. I'm 52, a landscape architect by trade, and an environmental planner by heart. This yard? It's not just grass and flowers. It's the result of a lifetime studying native ecology, urban runoff, pollinator corridors, and sustainable design. Every plant in my garden, from the coneflowers to the milkweed, was chosen with purpose. Some are protected by the state. Others were grown from seed I collected while hiking with my daughter. So when Karen told me my lawn didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, it wasn't just insulting. It was ignorant. And it was personal. What she saw as weeds were monarch nurseries. What she called overgrown was a carefully structured stormwater buffer. But that's the thing about power trips. They rarely come with a field guide. She didn't know I'd helped draft the statewide Sustainable Landscaping Ordinance back in 2012, or that I'd advised 3 cities on eco-compliant community standards. She just saw a woman with a wild-looking yard and assumed she could tame it. Well, she picked the wrong pollinator patch. Where are you watching from? Have you ever been told to rip out something beautiful just because someone else didn't understand? When I first moved to Riverbend Hills, I wasn't looking for perfection. I was looking for peace. It was early spring, March of 2019, when I closed on the house. The lot wasn't huge, but it backed up to a strip of uncut woods, and the soil was soft and full of memory. Not the kind of memory you find in concrete curbs or asphalt, at driveways, but the kind that lives under your fingernails when you dig deep enough. It was the kind of place where roots could grow, mine and my gardens. I'd spent nearly 3 decades designing parks, greenways, and sustainable yards for other people, cities, schools, even a few corporate campuses trying to look a little more eco-conscious after building over wetlands. But this yard? This was the first one I got to build for me. No artificial turf, no boxwood hedges, no plastic edging. I started small. A border of native eastern columbine near the porch. A pocket of coreopsis and blazing star where the lawn dipped gently toward the sidewalk. I pulled up the old ornamental grass that had been smothered in red mulch and replaced it with a habitat mosaic, layers of bloom and structure that changed with the seasons. In spring, the bees came. By summer, the butterflies danced through the coneflowers, and in early fall, the goldfinches would pluck seeds straight from the standing stalks. My daughter Nina loved it. She'd wake up and go barefoot across the clover path, watching ants march along the edge of the bird bath. On weekends, we'd sit on the deck drinking coffee and herbal tea, cataloging the colors of bloom like we were keeping inventory of joy itself. The neighbors at first were curious. Maggie and Ron next door would wave as I wheelbarrowed compost across the yard. "That looks like a lot of work," Maggie said one morning. "It's the kind of work that pays off in patience." I smiled. She nodded. "Better than mowing." The HOA guidelines didn't say much about landscaping, just maintained appearance and neighborhood cohesion, vague enough to be interpreted kindly or weaponized. At the time, I figured kindness would win out. I wasn't trying to make a statement, not yet. I just wanted to build a little sanctuary that didn't need chemicals to survive, that didn't demand fossil fuels to stay tidy. I added a rain garden to catch the runoff from my roof, and after 2 storms, even Ron commented on how I never had standing water like the rest of the street. I smiled again. "That's native sedge doing its job." He nodded, pretending to know what sedge was. Over time, birds started showing up I hadn't seen in years. Cedar waxwings, Carolina wrens, towhees. I kept a notebook of their visits, not for any official report, just for myself. By the start of the 2nd year, my yard had become more than just a garden. It was a living classroom, a medicine for anxiety, a rewilded space in a cookie-cutter neighborhood. I taught Nina how to plant milkweed, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because monarchs depended on it. We hung signs for no spray zones and certified pollinator habitat, and several neighbors even asked me to help them rework their own yards. I led a free workshop at the community center called Landscaping with Purpose. 12 people showed up. That might not sound like much, but in a suburb like Riverbend Hills, it was a revolution. People started talking about switching to clover lawns. Others asked me about reducing irrigation. For a while, I thought things were changing. Even Karen seemed polite at the start. She lived 3 houses down in a pristine beige stucco 2-story with a black mulch perimeter and perfectly clipped boxwoods. Her yard looked like something off a brochure, if that brochure were advertising expensive conformity. At neighborhood mixers, she'd tilt her head at me. "Interesting choices you're making," she said one time, gesturing toward the garden. I took it as a compliment. "Thanks. Trying to reduce water use and boost pollinators." "Oh," she said, her smile too wide. "That's admirable." There were other signs, in retrospect. She'd frown when dandelions popped up. She'd mention property values like it was a prayer, a bow. And once, I caught her taking a photo of my yard with her phone while pretending to text. Still, I ignored it. Because why assume the worst? We were neighbors, and neighbors might disagree on aesthetics, but they don't go to war over wildflowers, do they? Back then, I still believed that beauty would speak for itself, that a patch of Joe Pye weed and ironweed buzzing with bees could win over even the most stubborn HOA members, that maybe we were moving past the age of lawns like carpets, sterile and unnatural. I believed that if something was done with care and with intention, it would be respected. But what I didn't know was that Karen had recently been appointed to the HOA Compliance Committee. What I didn't know was that someone had filed a complaint about unsightly yard growth citing neighborhood disharmony, and that the committee had taken it seriously. What I didn't know was that Riverbend Hills was about to become a battleground, and my garden, its first casualty. And it? Stick around, because what started as a neighbor's complaint about too many flowers turned into a legal standoff that reached all the way to the state zoning board. What I didn't know was that Karen had been watching all along, not admiring, not curious, just monitoring. It started with a letter, folded neatly, taped to my mailbox, unsigned. "Your yard is in violation of community standards. The HOA has received multiple complaints about overgrowth, weeds, and wildlife-attracting debris. Please address the issue immediately." No logo, no official heading, no name, just a passive-aggressive ghost note in a tidy font printed on crisp white paper that practically hissed when I unfolded it. At first I laughed. I'd dealt with these types before, people who confuse wildlife corridor with mess, who think anything not mowed to 2 inches is a threat to their resale value. I tossed Toes. He note in the recycling bin and moved on. I added a rain garden to catch the runoff from my roof, and after 2 storms, even Ron commented on how I never had standing water like the rest of the street. I smiled again. "That's native sedge doing its job." He nodded, pretending to know what sedge was. Over time, birds started showing up I hadn't seen in years. Cedar waxwings, Carolina wrens, towhees. I kept a notebook of their visits, not for any official report, just for myself. By the start of the 2nd year, my yard had become more than just a garden. It was a living classroom, a medicine for anxiety, a rewilded space in a cookie-cutter neighborhood. I taught Nina how to plant milkweed, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because monarchs depended on it. We hung signs for no spray zones and certified pollinator habitat, and several neighbors even asked me to help them rework their own yards. I led a free workshop at the community center called Landscaping with Purpose. 12 people showed up. That might not sound like much, but in a suburb like Riverbend Hills, it was a revolution. People started talking about switching to clover lawns. Others asked me about reducing irrigation. For a while, I thought things were changing. Even Karen seemed polite at the start. She lived 3 houses down in a pristine beige stucco 2-story with a black mulch perimeter and perfectly clipped boxwoods. Her yard looked like something off a brochure, if that brochure were advertising expensive conformity. At neighborhood mixers, she'd tilt her head at me. "Interesting choices you're making," she said one time, gesturing toward the garden. I took it as a compliment. "Thanks. Trying to reduce water use and boost pollinators." "Oh," she said, her smile too wide. "That's admirable." There were other signs, in retrospect. She'd frown when dandelions popped up. She'd mention property values like it was a prayer, a bow. And once, I caught her taking a photo of my yard with her phone while pretending to text. Still, I ignored it. Because why assume the worst? We were neighbors, and neighbors might disagree on aesthetics, but they don't go to war over wildflowers, do they? Back then, I still believed that beauty would speak for itself, that a patch of Joe Pye weed and ironweed buzzing with bees could win over even the most stubborn HOA members, that maybe we were moving past the age of lawns like carpets, sterile and unnatural. I believed that if something was done with care and with intention, it would be respected. But what I didn't know was that Karen had recently been appointed to the HOA Compliance Committee. What I didn't know was that someone had filed a complaint about unsightly yard growth citing neighborhood disharmony, and that the committee had taken it seriously. What I didn't know was that Riverbend Hills was about to become a battleground, and my garden, its first casualty. And it? Stick around, because what started as a neighbor's complaint about too many flowers turned into a legal standoff that reached all the way to the state zoning board. What I didn't know was that Karen had been watching all along, not admiring, not curious, just monitoring. It started with a letter, folded neatly, taped to my mailbox, unsigned. Your yard is in violation of community standards. The HOA has received multiple complaints about overgrowth, weeds, and wildlife-attracting debris. Please address the issue immediately. No logo, no official heading, no name, just a passive-aggressive ghost note in a tidy font printed on crisp white paper that practically hissed when I unfolded it. At first I laughed. I'd dealt with these types before, people who confuse wildlife corridor with mess, who think anything not mowed to 2 inches is a threat to their resale value. I tossed Toes. He note in the recycling bin and moved on. I asked if I could present documentation. Karen responded with a smirk. You've already had your say. The vote was held behind closed doors. The fine doubled to $200 a day until compliance was achieved. I went home, sat on my deck, watched a monarch land on a swamp milkweed just as the sun began to dip. I thought of all the hours Nina and I had spent out here, cataloging species, planting seed, watering with care. I thought of how many times I'd given talks about native landscapes, how many homeowners I'd helped through the exact same code confusion I was now being punished with. And that's when it hit me. Karen didn't misunderstand the rules. She was counting on everyone else to. This wasn't about plants. It wasn't about bylaws. It was about power and the illusion of authority. And that's when I stopped playing defense. Because if Karen wanted to fight over landscaping compliance, she'd just picked the wrong person. The irony? She was quoting from a regulation that didn't even exist in its current form until I helped write it. Karen was quoting from a regulation that didn't even exist in its current form until I helped write it. That realization should have brought me comfort, but instead, it made me more uneasy. Because if she was that bold, confident enough to twist language I personally authored, what else was she willing to manipulate? The answer arrived, as always, in my mailbox. Another letter, this one printed in italics. Failure to comply has now reached enforcement threshold. You are hereby notified that legal proceedings may begin within 14 days unless corrective action is taken. Daily fines now set at $250. I read it twice. Enforcement threshold, a term that doesn't exist in the actual Riverbend Hills HOA charter, nor in any municipal code I've ever read, and I've read plenty. It was a fabricated phrase designed to intimidate. Bureaucratic codes. Play. I walked outside and stood at the edge of my yard. The wildflowers were in their summer bloom. The purple ironweed stood 6 feet tall, as proud and defiant as I felt. And then I saw it. A red flag, literal this time. A small, triangular, property in violation flag staked right into my front garden bed, next to the milkweed Nina had planted on Earth Day. I yanked it out and stood there holding it like it was evidence from a crime scene, which, in a way, it was. The HOA wasn't just sending letters now, they were staking claims, physically marking my home like I was some kind of trespasser on my own soil, and that's when the anonymous letters began. Folded sheets of notebook paper, no return address, sometimes slipped under my mat, once wedged under my windshield wiper. Just follow the rules like everyone else. This isn't a wildlife preserve. We know you're doing this on purpose. At night, I'd hear cars slow roll past the house. Once, someone threw a bag of lawn clippings into my driveway. I tried to keep my head down, but it's hard to stay quiet when the whole neighborhood starts treating you like a pariah for growing bee balm. Even Nina started noticing. Why did Mrs. Patterson cross the street when she saw us? I didn't have an answer. I just changed the subject. At school drop-off, one mom who used to chat with me every morning suddenly turned her back. Another asked me without any irony if I had considered just cutting everything back to look a little more presentable. It was the kind of slow-motion exile you don't notice at first, like a temperature drop you don't feel until your fingertips are already numb. The final straw? A notice pinned to my front door, not mailed, not slipped into the mailbox, pinned with a thumbtack into the wood. It was a formal cease and desist letter, this time referencing imminent legal action. It included a list of unauthorized species found in my garden. Among them, milkweed, goldenrod, switchgrass, all of them native species. All of them specifically listed as encouraged in the state's own Model Sustainable Landscape Ordinance, which I drafted. I looked at the bottom of the letter, prepared by Karen Whitmore, HOA Compliance Officer, co-signed by Robert V. Drennan, HOA Legal Counsel. I stared at that second name. I'd never heard of Robert Drennan. He wasn't listed on the HOA website. So I did what any environmental planner with a land use legal background would do. I researched. He wasn't a real attorney. He was Karen's cousin, an insurance claims adjuster who had once taken a paralegal course online. There was no active bar license, no law firm, just a shared last name on a family tree and a borrowed legal template. That's when I realized something deeper was going on. This wasn't just about my yard. This was about control. And suddenly, a detail I'd dismissed earlier snapped into focus. The abandoned lot 3 houses down, the one Karen had been eyeing for weeks, the one the HOA had been quietly trying to reclaim due to neglect, the one next to my property. If Karen could get my yard labeled non-compliant, she could expand her control zone. 2 adjoining parcels under HOA disciplinary action? That gave the board leverage, and leverage could mean rezoning for profit or even using accumulated fines to force a lien. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about acquisition, a silent land grab hidden under the language of compliance. I told Maggie, hoping for support. She looked away and whispered, "You know Karen's husband is trying to flip that lot, right? That's why she's going after you." And just like that, the picture was clear. I wasn't being shamed for weeds, I was being targeted because my yard was in the way. My milkweed wasn't a violation, it was an obstacle. I called a friend at the State Environmental Council. I sent copies of every letter I'd received. I forwarded screenshots of the HOA charter, circled the manipulated clauses, and attached side-by-sides with the real municipal code. Within 72 hours, I had an email back, not just from my contact, but from a senior counsel at the State Zoning Review Board. This sounds like a textbook overreach of HOA power and a potential misapplication of code authority. We'd like to open a formal inquiry. For the first time in months, I felt air in my lungs again. Because now, it wasn't just me versus Karen. Now it was me and the law versus a wannabe dictator in a pantsuit with a clipboard. And I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to expose her. Because if she could twist my own ordinance into a weapon, then I was going to take that weapon back and aim it right at the heart of her campaign. If Karen thought I was just a hobbyist with a garden and a temper, she was about to learn a painful lesson. Because I wasn't just a landscape designer, I was a certified environmental planner, a contributor to the statewide Model Landscape Ordinance, co-signed by the Department of Natural Resources. And for the last 2 years, I'd served as a consultant for municipal code audits in 6 cities. She wasn't just picking a fight with a homeowner, she was picking a fight with the architect of the very law she was trying to weaponize. But here's the thing, I didn't storm into her office, I didn't send threats or fire off angry emails. I went quiet. And while she smirked in HOA meetings and mailed fake fines like candygrams, I was building something much stronger than outrage. I was building a case. I started with a timeline, every citation, every letter, every phone call. I cataloged them into a spreadsheet, date, time, sender, language used, and the specific clause they referenced. Then I added the real language, from the e-city code, from the state ordinance, from the HOA charter itself. Next to each claim, I marked a column, true or fabricated. Out of 17 citations I'd received, which were completely false, 4 were misquoted or stripped of context. Not a single one held up under scrutiny. I went out with my camera. I took close-ups of my plants, the milkweed, the coreopsis, the echinacea, the switchgrass, all native species explicitly protected under State Code 81112, encouraged biodiversity and native landscape compliance. I included photos of pollinators in action, ladybugs, monarchs, bees. I filmed water runoff after a storm, showing how my garden absorbed flow while neighboring properties flooded into the street. Then I photographed other homes. Karen's, for example, with its red-dyed mulch leaching color into the sidewalk, with its invasive English ivy creeping into storm drains, with her sprinkler system running during a water advisory week, violation after violation, all documented. I wasn't just going to prove I was in the right. I was going to show that Karen's enforcement was selective, personal, abusive. I wrote a letter, not emotional, not accusatory, just professional, addressed to the State Zoning Review Board, the City Landscape Compliance Office, and the statewide HOA Oversight Task Force. Yes, there is such a task force. And yes, they take complaints from credentialed professionals very seriously. I attached everything. The spreadsheet of misused citations, my annotated HOA charter, visual documentation, screenshots of the anonymous letters, and proof of Robert Drennan's false legal representation. Then, for good measure, I included a signed affidavit from a former HOA board member, someone who had quietly stepped down 2 months ago and was finally ready to talk. She confirmed what I already suspected. Karen is pushing citations selectively. She's trying to use non-compliance as a way to pressure certain residents. She said more isur et CEO, even once that she wants to clean up the street. It's personal, not procedural. I thanked her and filed the letter under Exhibit F. I called a contact at the local public radio affiliate who had once interviewed me about sustainable design. I told her off the record what was going on. She said, "You're kidding. A homeowner being targeted over native plants by an HOA officer with a family real estate interest?" I just said, "Not kidding." She asked if I'd be willing to share documents. I said yes, after the legal filing. Next, I reached out to State Representative Colleen Wright. She'd championed the 2012 Landscape Reform Bill. We'd worked on it together, in fact. She remembered me. "Tanya? Of course I remember. You were the one who flagged the loophole on invasive cultivars. What's going on?" I explained everything, sent her the packet. By the end of the call, she said something I'll never forget. "This is exactly the kind of thing we wrote that bill to prevent. I'll flag it with our Legal Affairs Committee. Keep your head down and keep documenting." While all of this was happening, I took one last step. I backed everything up. Printed copies, USB drives, cloud folders, one with my attorney, one with my daughter, one hidden in plain sight. Because people like Karen count on two things: that you'll panic, that you'll quit. But I wasn't quitting. I was archiving. By the time the next HOA meeting came around, something had shifted. Karen was quieter, tighter. The usual smirk on her face looked more forced than usual. I showed up with my binder again, but this time I didn't open it, because I didn't need to anymore. The State Zoning Review Board had sent a formal letter to the HOA president, not Karen, requesting immediate clarification on citation practices and language usage. The city's compliance office had launched a preliminary investigation. And the public radio station? They were now interviewing homeowners across multiple neighborhoods dealing with similar HOA overreach. Karen just happened to be their best example. Then came the email from the HOA president. "Due to recent events and legal inquiries, all enforcement actions regarding your property are hereby suspended pending further review." In short, they backed down, and just like that, the script flipped. Neighbors who had avoided me now stopped to talk again. Maggie brought over lemon bars and said, "I always loved the goldenrod, by the way." Ron sheepishly asked if I'd help him turn his backyard into a mini native patch. Even Nina said, "It feels normal again." But I wasn't done, because this wasn't just about me. It was about every homeowner who's ever been bullied by someone hiding behind a clipboard and a twisted clause. It was about every wildflower labeled a weed, every bee blamed for being a nuisance, every carefully tended yard called messy by someone who couldn't tell the difference between diversity and disorder. Because what Karen didn't know was that I don't just grow things. I build systems that hold up under pressure. And hers was about to crack wide open. Karen didn't see it coming. She'd spent months on offense, waving citations like a sword, expecting every swing to land. But what she never counted on was that I'd studied every inch of the battlefield before she ever took the field. Because while she was playing neighborhood tyrant with a clipboard, I was laying out policy architecture with real lawyers, real lawmakers, and a paper trail so tight it could choke a lie at 20 paces. And now it was time for everyone else to see it too. The date was August 17th, the HOA's quarterly General Assembly. Usually these meetings were quiet affairs. A few retirees, some tired parents, board members sipping tepid coffee, while they argued over mulch color and mailbox styles, but this time, the room was packed. I arrived 5 minutes early, binder in hand, documents neatly tabbed, and a discreet manila folder labeled Supporting Evidence Property 132B. I didn't plan to speak unless asked. My work was already done. Karen, on the other hand, showed up late. Hair flat-ironed sharp, lips tight, clipboard clutched like a weapon she knew was about to backfire. She took a seat on the board's left flank, glanced at me once, and quickly looked away. The HOA president, Mr. Ellison, called the meeting to order and went through the usual agenda: budget updates, security proposals, garbage day reminders. Then he paused. Next item, inquiry into recent enforcement practices, specifically related to the property at 132B, currently maintained by resident Tanya Blake. The room hushed. As you may be aware, the HOA has received inquiries from the State Zoning Review Board, the City Landscape Compliance Office, and the statewide HOA Oversight Task Force. These inquiries include formal documentation and concern the legitimacy and origin of citations issued over the past 4 months. He cleared his throat, folded his hands. Ms. Blake has submitted extensive evidence, including comparative code language, supporting images, expert witness statements, and official co-authorship of the very ordinance used as justification for the penalties levied against her. Whispers rippled through the chairs. Karen raised her hand. "I'd like to respond to that." "You'll have your turn," Mr. Ellison said, sharper than I expected, "but we will begin with a presentation of the findings." And then, to my surprise, he gestured toward Ms. Felton, the HOA's secretary. She walked to the front and unrolled a projector screen. That's when I realized this wasn't just going to be a quiet civil discussion. This was going to be a tribunal. Slide 1. Side-by-side comparisons of citations I received versus the actual language of the HOA Charter and City Code. All clearly mismatched. Slide 2. Photos of native species wrongly labeled as non-compliant, each one annotated with its state-supported status under Ordinance 8.112. Slide 3. A digital timeline. Dates of notices, emails, fines, and Karen's involvement, including her co-signature with Robert V. Drennan, who, as the next slide confirmed, was not a licensed attorney. The silence in the room got heavier with each page. Then came the last slide, a bullet point summary titled, Findings of Potential Misconduct. Fabrication of regulatory language, misapplication of citations, selective enforcement targeting a single property, conflict of interest linked to adjacent parcel rezoning, false representation of legal authority. At that point, the room no longer looked curious. They looked angry, betrayed, embarrassed. Karen spoke again, this time louder, defensive. "I was trying to uphold standards. This is a coordinated attack. She's manipulating public officials, using media to sway opinions." She turned to me. "You're the one who made this personal." And for the first time, I spoke. "I didn't make it personal, Karen. You did. I just made it public." The room erupted. A few neighbors even clapped. That's when the voices started rising. Not mine, but theirs. Ron stood up, holding a copy of one of Karen's mailed notices. I didn't even know what aesthetic disharmony meant until Tanya showed me what was really going on. I signed a petition I didn't understand, and I regret it. Then Maggie, visibly upset. "I thought she was being dramatic, but Karen, you staked a violation sign in her daughter's flower bed. That wasn't about rules, that was about humiliation." Then came Mrs. Langley, an older woman from the cul-de-sac. "So, Karen fined me for having a bird bath taller than 24 inches. Then I saw hers. It's 30. I measured it." Another neighbor chimed in. "Is that what we're doing now? Turning on each other? Is that what our HOA is for?" By the end of the comment period, it was no longer about me. It was about them, about all the small violations they'd brushed off as policy that now looked more like personal power games. The HOA president stood again. "Based on what we've seen, I'd like to make a motion to suspend Karen Whitmore from all enforcement duties pending a third-party review." He looked around. "All in favor?" Hands shot up, nearly unanimous. Karen stood there frozen, face flushed but locked in that corporate smile, the kind that tries to hold together a collapsing wall of authority. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Because this wasn't just a takedown, it was a reckoning. And it wasn't mine, it was the neighborhood's. Later that week, the public radio story aired, a feature on HOAs misusing power and the homeowners who fought back. Karen's name wasn't mentioned directly, but phrases like misleading citations, fake legal threats, and weaponized compliance painted a clear picture. I got emails from homeowners in other counties. 2 neighborhood associations reached out asking if I'd speak at their sustainability meetings. And one email came from Representative Colleen Wright with the subject line, "Want to help draft a bill to rein in rogue HOAs?" I smiled, because now the story wasn't just about one garden. It was about fixing the whole system. As for Karen, she resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks later. No press release, no fanfare, just a quiet memo tucked at the end of the HOA newsletter. We thank Ms. Whitmore for her service and wish her well. But neighbors noticed. They always do. After Karen resigned, Riverbend Hills took a long, collective breath. Not a cheer, not a party, just quiet relief, like a weight finally lifted from the chest of a neighborhood that hadn't even realized it was holding its breath. The next few weeks moved slowly, softly. People started waving again. Sidewalk chats returned. Conversations shifted from violations and citations to bird sightings, rain gardens, and when to sow milkweed. It wasn't just that Karen was gone, it was that her departure left space for things to grow, literally and metaphorically. Not a single flower was cut, not one blade trimmed to comply. In fact, the state zoning board sent a letter formally stating that my garden was fully compliant, not only with HOA rules, but with municipal incentives for sustainable landscaping. They even featured it on their website under Model Urban Habitats. Photo number 3, Nina's milkweed bed, complete with a monarch chrysalis tucked beneath a leaf. That image was downloaded and shared over 4,000 times by homeowners across the state, each one realizing maybe they weren't wrong for wanting something more alive than grass and edging. The irony, what Karen had tried to erase became a regional example of what should be. At the next HOA meeting, I stood and proposed a motion. I'd like to revise the landscaping guidelines to allow for native habitat zones, establish protections for pollinator plants, and clarify language to prevent future misuse. There was no protest. The motion passed unanimously. The charter was rewritten, this time with community input, with clarity, not ambiguity, and with language grounded in ecology, not in personal preference. We added a clause that protected certified native landscapes from HOA penalty. We created a subcommittee for sustainable property stewardship, and they asked me to chair it. I said yes, on one condition: I'm not here to enforce taste. I'm here to protect balance. They agreed, and jippy. It's like that, the system that once tried to shame me was now bearing my fingerprints in every line. Nina, being Nina, turned all of this into a movement of her own. She started a kids' garden club called the Pollinator Posse. Every Sunday, a handful of neighborhood kids showed up in my backyard with gloves, seed packs, and dirty sneakers. We taught them to spot monarch eggs, to understand the role of bees, to distinguish native plants from invasive ones. They planted a shared plot by the storm drain, called it the Raindrop Garden. Within a month, it was full of bee balm, little blue stem, and, of course, milkweed. It wasn't just a lesson in plants. It was a lesson in ownership, in resilience, in knowing that beauty doesn't need permission to bloom. The radio segment got picked up by a local news outlet, then a regional blog, then a national gardening magazine. The headline? HOA tried to kill a wild garden. It grew a movement instead. I did an interview, told them the truth, not just about the fines and letters, but about the feeling of being isolated, misrepresented, and reduced to a threat for simply doing something different. I talked about the power of clarity in policy and the danger of weaponized vagueness. The article went viral. Emails flooded in, homeowners, teachers, even city planners, asking for copies of my documentation, asking for guidance, asking how they could fight back against unfair HOA pressure. So I compiled everything, built a public PDF resource kit. How to Defend Your Garden, a homeowner's guide to HOA-proof landscaping. Within a month, it had been downloaded over 11,000 times. And then, one morning in late September, I got a letter in the mail. no return address. I opened it, cautious. Inside, a photo of Karen's once pristine yard, now overtaken by crabgrass and browned-out hedges, her for sale sign stuck in the front lawn like a Y.T. flag. There was no note, but I didn't need one. She'd moved, quietly. No goodbye, no explanation. The woman who once ruled over the neighborhood like a code-slinging monarch was gone, leaving behind a faded lawn and a legacy of resentment. And in her place, goldenrod, liatris, coneflowers. 3 houses, including Ron's, had begun converting to native landscapes, free of fines, free of shame, free to grow. Sometimes the most radical act is to let things live, to let a yard grow a little wilder, a little messier, to invite butterflies instead of applause, to build something that doesn't ask for approval, only respect. Karen wanted me to mow it all down. What she didn't realize was, you can't mow down roots that run this deep. And now my garden is more than flowers. It's a reminder that silence is never compliance, that credentials matter, but courage matters more, and that no ordinance, no matter how twisted by small minds, can outlast something planted in love and protected by truth. Closing line. They tried to find me for my flowers, now they ask me for seeds. If you've ever been told to cut down something you built with care, if you've been fined, shamed, or silenced by someone hiding behind policy, if you've ever wondered whether it's worth standing up when no one else is clapping, I hope this story gave you your answer. Because rules don't protect us unless we make sure they're written with truth, not fear. And sometimes the smallest things, a patch of milkweed, a stubborn homeowner, a 12-year-old planting seeds, can change everything. My name is Tanya, and I didn't just keep my garden. I helped others grow theirs too. So tell me, where are you watching from? Have you ever had to defend something that looked non-compliant, but was actually alive? Let me know in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone fighting their own version of Karen, share it with them. Because one yard may not seem like much, but enough of them, and we rewild the world.